Syria is engulfed in a long and bloody civil war. It is not as simple as saying the people are rising up against an evil dictator, President Assad. In this documentary, I would like to explore as to who is fighting who, what are the roles and goals of different foreign powers who are directly or indirectly involved in this war, and finally, who is winning and who is losing from this war. I'm Souad Sharabani. I asked Eric Margolis, political foreign affairs columnist, broadcaster, and a military analyst, to give us a brief analysis of Syrian's politics.
Syria, from the period at the end of World War II until the 1960s, late 60s, was very unstable, with one government after another being overthrown. One of the governments was overthrown by the United States. There were other governments, but none really had a strong grip on power. Hafez Assad was a Syrian Air Force general who came from the Alawi minority on the Mediterranean coast. And the Alawis, being one of the poorest sectors in Syria, sought work and joined the military because it offered them employment. So there was a strong Alawi presence in the military, particularly in the Air Force. And General Hafez Assad, he eventually became Air Force commander, but then he seized power and...
Okay, give us a breakdown. Majority are Sunnis.
Syria is, to use a overused word, a mosaic. It is a very fragmented state. It combines on the macro level. It combines city dwellers with country dwellers and almost desert dwellers. In parts of Syria, it looks like Saudi Arabia. In other parts, it looks like the south of Europe. Syria is, in general, a very sophisticated country with a very well-developed culture. Damascus is probably the oldest inhabited city on earth. And but the Syrian population is the majority are Sunni Muslims. Figures vary. Certainly at least half, if not 60%. You have 10% at least are Christians of various denominations, the oldest Christian churches in the world. You have another 10% to 15% who may be Kurds. You have another 10 to 18% who are Shia Alawis. And then you have some other odds and ends of people in there too. Armenians, Turkomen. You know, under the iron fist of the Assad clan, everybody managed to get along pretty well, and the religious disturbances were not tolerated.
Professor Joshua Landis is Associate Professor in the School of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma and Director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies.
The fall of minorities from power in the Levant, whether it's the Christians falling from Lebanon power during a long 15-year civil war, 200,000 people killed out of a country of 3 million. In Iraq, the Sunni fall from power. Of course, it was the Americans that sort of rooted the Sunni power, but the Shiites took over and have dominated Iraq. And they drove the Sunnis out of the security system. The military was disbanded, and they've rebuilt a Shiite authority. And the Sunnis have become radicalized. And there are car bombs going off every day. And the civil war is not over in Iraq by any means. It's been revivified by the war in Syria, because al-Qaeda has once again become a very powerful player in the entire region. So long and bloody in Iraq. And that, what we promised in Syria is, again, long and bloody, because the Alawites, the Christians, other religious minorities that make up about 20% of Syria, are clinging to power. They see Bashar al-Assad as their shield against Sunni domination and potentially a Islamist wing of this Sunni community taking power, in which would they see as being highly discriminatory and perhaps leading to some kind of ethnic cleansing from the region.
Before the recent civil war, have there ever been any other uprisings against the Assad regime?
There was strong resentment amongst the predominantly Sunni commercial class, the Bazari as they're called in Iran, to the socialist methods of the Assad family. In fact, for a long time, Syria's economy, Syria looked like a sort of an East Germany in the Mideast, and it was a very restrained, backwards, unproductive economy. But there was strong opposition as well. I remember amongst Sunnis to being ruled over by Shias, or certainly to Alawites, who many of the Sunnis regarded as heretics, or even dangerous heretics. And it was this Sunni opposition that exploded in I was there too, I just can't remember the date exactly, the 1970s, I think, or 1982, I was in Hama when it exploded, and Assad sent in the army and killed many thousands of people in very bitter fighting, leveled part of the city. So there was a Sunni religious cultural element and it was, since it was the majority, it had to be repressed very sternly by the Assad family.
There was some opposition, there were some demonstrations outside Damascus and so forth, but my understanding, there were not really significant opposition. It was not an uprising as we saw in Egypt.
It is fear of the regime, because the regime has used a lot of force in the past, but it's also because Syria is ethnically and religiously divided. In North Africa, everybody is a Sunni Arab. Now, of course, there are Copts in Egypt and there are Berbers in North Africa, but they don't have political power. They're not important to this Arab Spring. In Egypt, the military turned against the president, in part because they understood that they would all be rehired by the next government, because they're seen as a national army. Mm-hmm. In Syria, the military is a reflection of the president. The president, who's an Alawite, he comes from this heterodox religious community, has prepared for this uprising for 40 years by stacking the military and security upper echelons with Alawites and with his own family members at the very top. So it's extremely personalistic organization, very sectarian, in which Alawites dominate the Ba'ath Party, most importantly, the military and the security apparatus.
Some small protests did begin to break out far from Damascus, starting in the town of Dera, near the border with Jordan.
If the Sunni rebels, and the rebels are mostly Sunni, almost overwhelmingly Sunni, if the rebels take over and defeat the Assad regime, that entire military infrastructure is going to be purged. All the Alawites will be kicked out of their positions in the same way that the Sunnis in Iraq were purged, both from the Ba'ath Party was criminalized and the military was completely disbanded and had to be rebuilt from the bottom up on a basis of loyalty to a Shiite president. And today, the security forces in Iraq are dominated by Shiites. They used to be dominated by Sunnis. So what's really going on in Syria is only partially a battle between freedom and tyranny, the way it's depicted in the West. A large measure is a sectarian war of Sunnis who've been under the jackboot of minoritarian rule for the last 50 years, and they want to rule Syria. And they're going to, they believe that they're going to be able to take it militarily. But the minorities, with a large sector of the Sunni population, who are particularly the upper class urbanites, are still loyal to Assad. And that's why it's settled into this brutal civil war. It's divided. But what we're seeing in Syria is not a Syrian nationalism rising up. We're seeing sectarian identities reemerging and a larger Islamic identity. And the major rebel groups in Syria, whether in Aleppo or in Damascus, have raised the black flag of Islam as their central marker. They are not raising the revolutionary Syrian flag, tricolor, with stars in the middle. We've seen that revolutionary flag, which was the mark of the revolution in the first year, being replaced today by the black flag of jihad.
I don't think anybody supports Assad's repression. If you were against invasion of the American invasion of Iraq, it does not mean you support Saddam Hussein. On the other hand, what is happening here today, it seems like it's the hands of many countries involved in trying to get rid of Assad.
You have to remember that even though it was a very draconian police state, foreign powers were constantly trying to overthrow the Assad regime and stirring plots in Syria. So we can't always accuse countries of being too brutal when we are trying to overthrow their governments.
Syria has become a playground for this much larger struggle that's going on in the Middle East and in the international community. On the Middle East, there is a Sunni-Shiite struggle that's going on. Shiite authority, what's often called the Shiite Crescent, stretches from Iran to today Iraq, led by the Maliki government, dominated by Shiites, to Syria. Assad, who is a heterodox Shiite, and a Shiite minority there of about 12%, dominates the politics, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. A third of Lebanese are Shiite, roughly. And this power structure in this sort of crescent, reaching from Iran right over to Lebanon, is being challenged by Sunni powers. First and foremost is Saudi Arabia, sitting in the Gulf with lots of money, that sees Iran as a terrible threat and was very upset when Iraq switched from being a Sunni-dominated state under Saddam to a Shiite-dominated state that was allied with Iran. And in many ways, Saudi Arabia wants to make up for the loss of Iraq as a Sunni nation by getting Syria, a Sunni win in Syria, in which the Sunnis would take over from the Shiites and ally themselves with Saudi Arabia against Shiites in Iraq and Iran.
The Saudis are petrified of Iran. Everything they do is designed to damage Iran. You know, Iran and the Saudis, I've seen it all over in Afghanistan. They've been fighting a proxy war since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And we don't often see it, but it's a bitter undercover thing. A lot of the so-called terrorist attacks that we've endured were groups created by the Saudis or the Iranians to fight each other, not to fight us. So the Saudis are determined to overthrow an ally of Iran, and its most important one. Because also, you know, Syria was one of the few countries that was not totally under the West's thumb, and which didn't, you know, click its heels, bow every time the phone rang for Washington.
The American or the Israeli, they would rather see chaos in that country, like in Iraq, and weaken their support to Iran than seeing a strong hand in Syria, but stable hand. I mean,
well, it's a very good question. I have trouble with this myself. Now, I know in the 90s that the U.S. and Israel, and the Bush administration particularly, and Israel had planned an invasion of Syria. They were going to try and crush Hezbollah in Lebanon. They were going to go and march on Damascus and overthrow the Assad regime. But then finally somebody in Washington had the brains to ask, well, yeah, but who are you going to put in power once you've overthrown the Ba'ath Party? And there are a lot of angry Sunnis with scores to settle who are very revolutionary, and that may not go along with American policy. So the Americans, for once, did something intelligent, backed off. But the change came about in the last year or two when the U.S. and Israel determined it was time to attack Iran. And the road to Tehran, as General Ariel Sharon used to keep saying after the U.S. invaded Iraq, kept saying, keep going, keep going. The road to Tehran runs through Damascus. And in the rush to punish Iran, they decided to knock off its only real Arab ally, Syria. And from there, they would begin their unraveling or undermining of Iraq militarily. So that's why the decision was made to go after Syria.
Israel, at first, embraced the notion that Assad should go and said, we do not want the devil we know over the devil we don't know. Israel saw this as an opportunity to destroy advanced weapon systems that Assad had, missiles and so forth, support for Hezbollah.
I think that it is in the interest of certain sort of imperialist camp in the West to divide and conquer. Presse diviser, or the old Roman way. This has been the history of the Middle East. In the 1920s, there was a famous Zionist thinker, theoretician named Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky said very presciently, then he said, the whole Arab world is a brittle mosaic. Give it a few hard raps, it will fall apart into its constituent tribal pieces, and Israel will be left the dominant power in the region. This is exactly what's happening. We have destroyed, the United States has now destroyed two of Israel's principal enemies, Iraq and Syria. The Egyptians are completely defanged, if you want. And this is opening up a whole period of what I call a new imperial era, a reborn 21st century colonialism.
I think that the United States is beginning to see that it wants to balance Saudi Arabia and Iran. It sees the rise of al-Qaeda and Sunni jihadism in Syria. And it's thinking, well, we don't want a total Sunni win in Syria. We want to balance Saudi Arabia against Iran, Shiites against Sunnis. And we don't want one side to win. There is this major, the United States is negotiating with Assad about chemical weapons. It's negotiating with Iran about nuclear weapons. It's working with Russia to bring about some kind of new ceasefire in Syria that doesn't necessarily destroy the Syrian regime of Assad. Of course, the United States wants to see Assad go, but they don't want to see the regime destroyed and the Syrian army completely destroyed. So
let's go to the next country, Turkey.
I do not have the answer to Turkey. I write for Turkish newspapers. I follow Turkey closely, and I don't understand what came over Prime Minister Erdogan. Here's this brilliant and successful leader who's led Turkey over 10 years, who broke the power of the Turkish army and forced the generals back to their barracks, and who's revitalized the Turkish economy. He's done everything right. And then what he does, he set a role model for the entire Arab world too. And then what does he do? He gets involved in this mess in Syria, which I cannot see how this can benefit Turkey at all. And in fact, the majority of Turks, by opinion polls, are against what he does. The minute that the tide turned, and this whole gas thing happened and everything else, the Turks said, well, wait a minute, Assad may win. We better start backing off and hedging our bets.
What is Russia's interest in Syria?
Influence, naval base in Tartus on the Syrian coast. But President Putin has not shown a great deal of interest in the Middle East.
No.
And my feel is that the Russians have dug in their heels there because it's a matter of face. Mm-hmm. They're fed up with the U.S. Pushing NATO influence right to the borders of Russia and in the Caucasus. And they said enough. You've got to stop doing this, particularly after the Georgian War. And the Russians, obviously, they don't want all of their influence in the Middle East clipped. We North Americans, for example, do not understand that Syria is as close to Russia as Guadalajara, Mexico, is to the United States. Yeah. And Russia is upgrading its diplomatic stature and has moved really brilliantly between Putin and Lavrov as foreign minister to resolve this made-up Syrian poison gas crisis.
Where is Jordan? I mean, it's not exactly model democracy here. Where is Jordan in all this?
Jordan is frightened, and the U.S. has quietly put troops and Air Force units into Jordan, as the British did in previous years, to make sure that the king is kept on the throne. But the reason I mentioned Dera is interesting, that's where the revolt began, is because you can track along the western border of Syria that all the uprisings began just over the border and in places where the rebels were fueled and armed and financed and supplied from Turkey and a bit from Lebanon, but a lot from Jordan. So
Jordan went from nothing to something, and the Hashemite monarchy has been quite successful. The Hashemite monarchy has also been successful at balancing the native Jordanians against the Palestinians. And we have to remember that 60% of the population is Palestinian. The Muslim Brotherhood, which has been the major challenger against the king, is dominated by Palestinians. So the king has been able to balance these two sides and shore up the nationalism of the local Jordanians against the Palestinians.
The Hezbollah, to send fighters to Syria, I mean, does it make sense politically?
Politically iffy, but militarily it makes sense because Hezbollah is surrounded by hostile territory. Yeah. Its supply lines, except for Syria, its supply lines for getting arms and munitions and other fighters coming in run through Syria. Without Syria, Hezbollah would be totally isolated and at the mercy of its enemies. And the survival of the Assad regime is very important to the Hezbollah leadership of Sheikh Nasrallah. Where the Hezbollah fighters were involved were largely along the border in villages that are inhabited by Shiites.
It doesn't make any sense to me that at this point Assad will gas his people when the whole world is looking at it. It doesn't make any sense politically that he would do it.
None whatsoever. I cannot begin to come up with a reason why the Assad forces would have done it unless it was a rogue unit. Some colonel who was angry over some dispute, his car got hit by another car, something like that. But the chemical weapons were under very tight control in Syria. The Western media has not explained to its readers that Syria developed these chemical weapons as a counterbalance to Israel's nuclear arsenal, not to threaten it. Chemical weapons are not of much use in regular warfare or this kind of urban warfare. We know that the Syrian opposition launched mortar attacks and rocket attacks against Turkey.
That's right.
To try and bring the Turks into the fighting against the government, and it almost worked. So if you ask me, I think there's about a 70% probability that the attacks were false flag attacks, as we call them in the intelligence business, and were done by the Syrian opposition, maybe by the Saudis, who knows?
You don't have a sense here of what the Syrians are really feeling right now.
Well, it's true. The opposition groups have alienated many of your average Syrians because they seem quite brutal. They're too Islamist, and they seem, attached to Saudi Arabia and other places that are funding them. But that's true. The large central mass of Syrians just want the fighting to stop. But they are, after all, 60% of Syrians are Sunni Arabs. Mm-hmm. They resented being ruled by minorities. Today, many of them are staying quiet and are fearful that these rebels will take over because they're too Islamist. But they don't like the Assad regime either. And so it leaves this whole question of Sunni versus minority, of upper class versus lower class, really undecided. And there isn't a resolution right now to all these deep questions of national identity.
So, and the religious minorities even more so. The Christians there are supporting Assad, not because they love him, but because they're afraid that will happen to them, happen to the Christians in Iraq who have been driven out, and the Kurds similarly, and the Armenians and so on. So there's great concern about that. And the fact that the economy of Syria has been destroyed or is in the process of being destroyed. Half of the economy is down by 50%. There's no business. People are going hungry. There are 5 million Syrian refugees from such a small country. It's absolutely horrifying. We have this pattern: Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Syria, of all these Muslim countries that are plowed up and destroyed, become targets of big power politics and are left in smoke and ruin.
The future seems very, very bleak for the Syrian people.
They are suffering now terribly, and they are going to suffer more. I don't see any end to the violence in Syria. I don't see the Saudis and the Turks, or the Americans for that matter, lessening up in their support for these rebel groups, even though they're being beaten by the Assad government forces, which probably makes the majority of Syrians happy. But it's very fraught. We hear talk in Washington of, let's rewrite the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1917 and redraw the borders of the Middle East. Well, it's happening.
So what is the future?
Future is it's long and bloody. The future is that both the regime, the Assad regime, and the Sunni rebels do not envisage the possibility, don't conceive of the possibility of cooperating with each other. The rebel commanders in most of their videos talk about the Alawites as majus. Majus is magi, and it's a term of abuse that refers to Zoroastrian Iranians, pre-Islamic Iranians. So by calling the Alawites majus, they are in a sense saying that they are crypto-Iranians, that they're neither Muslim nor are they Syrian. And the regime, the Assad regime, calls almost all the rebels Al-Qaeda, Takfiri, and they demonize them as beyond the pale of Islamic terrorists. So the two sides have completely otherized or demonized each other, and it's going to be very hard for them to sit down and work out a common vision for Syria. And Syria is as divided as ever, and it looks like it's headed towards some sort of partition, a de facto partition, with the regime dominant in the west and the south of the country, and the rebels controlling much of the north and the east, and perhaps even a little Kurdish bloc that has some sort of autonomy in the very far northeast towards Iraqi Kurdistan. And those are the two, those are the three major groups. The Kurds are ruling in the northeast. Their militias dominant there. Rebel militias, 1,000 of them scattered through the north and east, and the regime holding sway in west and south. And that's the status quo. It's been that way for almost a year and a half. And if there's peace talks, it'll stay that way.
And all these little countries, broken little fragments of countries, much easier to order around than the West. They are chaotic. They are a fertile bed for terrorism. But look, we're doing it anyway. Look in Somalia, where the U.S. has now got its own little war going on down there, which is just going to fragment the country even more. It's like a chariot of the juggernaut breaking up these countries. Just can't stop.
I'm Souad Sharabani.